not a perfect communicator. That might seem like a bit of a strange thing for somebody who's standing up here communicating to you about communication to say, but the reality is that none of us are perfect communicators. It's all something that we need to work on, but the good news is that it's something that we can improve on because it's a skill, communication skills. So I've got some pointers for you today, just a few small pointers that I'm going to share with you. But bear with me for a moment. I'd like you to please imagine a scenario. Ted is a mid-level manager. He's sitting at his desk one Monday morning and the phone rings. He answers the phone and the woman on the other end is extremely upset. She's a client, she's ranting and raving, she's shouting at Ted about service delivery. There were errors on the invoices that she got from the accounting department. They're sent her messages saying that she hasn't paid when she's paid, and altogether a very negative experience. Ted is obviously a little bit caught off guard. The woman's saying that she's not going to recommend his company to anybody, that she's not interested in using them again, and she even mentions going to Radio 1 and making a complaint. So you can imagine that Ted is not very happy about the situation. He walks out the door and goes straight to the accounting department and finds Francois, who handled the accounts, and he berates poor Francois in front of the entire accounting department. He's telling him that he's useless at his job, that he doesn't know what he's doing, and altogether needs to find another career. He then goes to Sarah in marketing, and he complains to her again in front of her co-workers because she hasn't handled the follow-up emails well, poor customer service, hasn't replied when she needs to. Francois decides he's had enough, he doesn't want to work for these people anymore, and he decides he's going to quit. Sarah is so upset, but she internalizes it, and instead the way that she handles her customers and her co-workers throughout the day is impacted. And the poor little receptionist spends 20 minutes in the bathroom crying and trying to pull herself together. So now this might seem like a little bit of an extreme situation. Maybe some of you are nodding and thinking, yeah, I can relate to that. But the reality is that conflict situations do happen in life, and poor communication does have a knock-on effect. What could have been, or what started as a negative situation, could have been turned into a learning curve, could have been turned into a good experience, whereas the reality was they lost a possibly good employee, and there was just bad vibes in the office after that. So there's a lot more to effective communication than just talking. Effective communication is just as much as what is said, as what is unsaid, as what is said. We need to think about what is inferred when we're speaking and not just about what we're saying. Effective communication essentially avoids confusion. It creates a positive working environment, which wasn't created in Ted's office. It provides purpose, and it builds accountability within the workplace. I've got 5 points that I feel are practical points that can be put into practice in the Mauritian workplace. So the first one, effective communication listens actively. What do I mean by that? Hearing is something that just happens. It's a biological response. Our brain interprets sound waves and turns it into sounds and meanings. Whereas listening, on the other hand, is something that we consciously choose to do. It's something that we decide to listen to what somebody's saying, and we decide to understand and grasp that understanding from what they're saying. So if we again look at our little example with Ted and his co-workers, how much listening really happened? When he was on the phone to the client, was he really listening to her? Or was he perhaps thinking about what he could say while she was talking, what he could say to placate her? Perhaps he was thinking of a witty comeback, or worse yet, a lie. What could he say? Oh, the accountant's been sick, his mother died, something like that. Or perhaps he was just not really listening at all and kind of carrying on doing what he was doing on the computer while he was holding the phone and just going, That is not actively listening. On the other hand, when he walked into the office and spoke to his co-workers, did he bother to find out that Francois is completely overworked, he's got far too much on his plate and he's just not coping? Or perhaps that Sarah's kids have been sick all week, she hasn't been sleeping well, and she's just really not managing to juggle her home life and her work life. He didn't bother to find anything out because he didn't listen. And that is why listening in the workplace is so essentially important as part of communication. So some quick pointers or practical pointers on how we can listen actively. Firstly, be open-minded to the other person's feedback. Actually listen to them. Do try to see things from the other person's perspective. Don't think about how to answer while the person is still talking. I think that's something a lot of us tend to do. Don't interrupt until you know the person is finished. Sometimes we interrupt because we think we know what they're going to say and we don't actually need to waste time listening to it, but that's not right. And don't listen and then just ignore what they've said and impose your preferred solution anyway. Okay, so number 2, so that was listening actively. Number 2, effective communication is attentive to body language. Body language is everything that we say without actually talking. And in fact, because it's subconscious, body language says a lot more than what our words actually say. It can be things from eye contact, from the posture, the way we talk, our pauses between words, where we use inflection and where we don't. It can be things like your use of touch, how close you are to somebody or how far you are from somebody. There are lots of aspects to body language and they're all very important. Again, let's look at Ted's example. Now you might be thinking, Ted is on the phone, so body language doesn't apply. Wrong. Body language does apply because yes, she couldn't see him, but she could hear his voice. She could hear, was he being sarcastic? Was he being condescending? Did he sound angry? Was he belittling her? All of that would have come out, not in the words he said, but in the way that he phrased those things and in the sound and the tone of his voice. And again, when he spoke to his co-workers, was he towering over Sarah with an intimidating fashion? When he spoke to the receptionist, was he very condescending, as if you don't know anything and that's why you're wrong? Is that what came across in his body language? All very important things to bear in mind. Did you know that because body language is subconscious, when we speak to somebody, if what we're saying and our body language are not the same, the person is more inclined to believe our body language than they are to actually believe our words. So be very, very careful to make sure that what you're saying with your body and what you're saying with your mouth actually line up, because otherwise it makes you seem dishonest. And nobody wants to be dishonest, especially when you're trying to make a sale. That's the last thing you want. So what are some aspects of body language we can look at? Firstly, do be aware of your facial expressions. Facial expressions are universal. Certain aspects of body language are based on culture, whereas facial expressions are universal. A smile in China, a smile in America, a smile in France, and a smile in Sierra Leone all mean the same thing. Do be careful of your body movement and your posture. I've spoken a little bit about this. How we hold ourselves, how we phrase ourselves, I suppose, for want of a better word, is going to say a lot to the person without us actually opening our mouths at all. Do be careful how you use gestures to avoid misinterpretation. I do a lot of scuba diving and we always do this under the water. I'm okay. It's like a universal scuba diving thing. But did you know that in some countries that's extremely offensive to use that? So we need to have a little bit of an idea and be careful with what we're doing so that we're not offending people. Obviously make eye contact. And what I mean by that is not just make eye contact with one person the whole time and ignore the rest of the room because you're more comfortable, it happens to be your best friend who's sitting at the boardroom table. We need to make eye contact with everybody in the room so that everybody feels included and heard. And not only that, what eye contact also does is it allows you to gauge if the person's understanding you, if they're completely bored with what you have to say, or if they're interested in what you have to say. Be aware of your use of touch. I shook somebody's hand today, and I was like a wet fish. What does that say about a person? It doesn't exactly breathe the air of success, does it? No. So be aware of your use of touch. If I pat somebody on the head, what does that say? It's very, very condescending. If I hug somebody, it can be warm, maybe a bit overly familiar for the workplace. Okay, if I sneer at somebody, it makes them feel incredibly disliked by me. So very, very important, your use of touch. Well, that's not exactly use of touch. Then don't invade another person's space. You might think, okay, yes, it's COVID, everybody knows that, 1 meter. Yeah, okay, that's important. But in general, invading a person's space is not always not always a good thing. Yes, it can show intimacy, but it can also show aggression. If you think of somebody that you find and they like get up into your face and you're right there and they're like shouting at you and the spit's flying. So obviously being aware of your use of space. And then lastly, thinking about your voice. How are you speaking? Are you speaking to an audience perhaps where the language you're speaking in is not their first language? Then you need to speak slower, use smaller words, for example. So all of that is very, very important to take into to think about. Okay, then number 3. Effective communication allows for cultural differences. Very important in the Mauritian workplace. In fact, we live in such a diverse community in Mauritius that we can, in a normal working day, perhaps come across an American, a Mauritian, a French person, a South African, a German, perhaps all in one morning. And if we don't know enough about other cultures, obviously we'll never know everything, but if we don't bear in mind that there are other cultures that impact how people do things in the business world, we are going to not be able to communicate with those people effectively. It's very, very important. So again, let's look at Ted. Now, take for an example, perhaps the woman on the other end of the line, English was not her first language. Ted was going on and trying to explain himself. She didn't really understand what he was saying. Maybe if they were face to face, she would have had a better idea, but sometimes speaking over the phone, it's quite difficult. And so maybe neither of them actually really understood each other at all. Perhaps the whole message behind the phone call was actually lost in translation. Very, very important to bear that in mind. Again, when he went into his office, into the office area, perhaps the receptionist was from a culture where it's seen as impolite to stand up to your superiors. So even though he berated her for something that was actually very innocent and out of her control, she didn't defend herself. She didn't do anything about it, and she rather just sat there and took it. So this is why it's important to know the people we work with, to understand the various cultures, because it will impact the way that we communicate with them. So again, how can we improve our cross-cultural communication? Firstly, do be interested in their culture. Know the people you work with. Yes, you'll never be able to completely understand their culture, but knowing a little bit about them will help you to understand why they're doing the things they do. I'm sure you guys can all agree with me. We've had that moment where you sit in the office and you think, why are you doing that? What is going through your mind? And that can be avoided if we understand the way that people do things and where that, and what the cultural influence in that situation is. Then, secondly, don't stereotype. People don't like to be put into boxes. You don't like to be put into boxes, so don't put other people into boxes. Do accept your own naivety. What do I mean by that? We all love to think, I'm a citizen of the world. I know everything. I know how to deal with all these different cultures. But the reality is that we actually don't. So we need to accept that we are naive. And if it means asking your co-workers questions to find out why they're doing the things they do, then that's what you need to do, because it'll help you to understand them better. Do develop your own cultural self-awareness. Know why you do the things you do. I'm South African. I know that sometimes South Africans can come across as quite abrasive, which I think a lot of other cultures do not appreciate. So that's something that I know I have to tamper down. I have to push back and not be this overbearing person, because it doesn't always bode well for me. Don't judge views that are different from yours as wrong. Very important. We all like to be the one who's in the right, but just because somebody's different, it doesn't mean what they think is wrong. And lastly, don't impose your own values on other people. There are a few values that I think are universal in the workplace, like, for example, honesty. But in general, don't impose your values on other people. Then my point number 4 is that effective communication handles conflict with diplomacy. Nobody likes conflict. I hate conflict situations. But the reality is that we're all going to find ourselves in a conflict situation from time to time. It's unavoidable. Ted answered the phone on that Monday morning, and without being prepared, he was slap bang in the middle of a conflict situation. There was nothing he could do about it, But did he have a plan to deal with it? No, he didn't. If he had a plan, he would have handled the situation very differently to the way he did. Again, when he dealt with his co-workers, did they stand up to him? Did it end up being a shouting match in the middle of the office? There needs to be ways we need to have a plan that enables us to deal with these conflict situations so that that kind of thing can be avoided. So what are some of the tools for handling conflict with diplomacy? Firstly, do learn to apologize. Not an easy one. Nobody here likes apologizing. We all like to be in the right. Sometimes we will fight tooth and nail for what we think and what we believe. But the reality is that an apology can do a lot to diffuse a potentially explosive situation. Sometimes a client just wants to hear an apology. Do understand that you don't need to be right. We're all human. We make mistakes. Some of us make mistakes more than others. But the reality is that we're never going to be perfect. We're never going to be right all the time. So what we need to do is understand that sometimes we are in the wrong, and then we need to accept responsibility for that. Do have a conflict action plan. This is something that I spoke a bit about Ted. He didn't have a conflict action plan. In fact, most call center operators during their training before they become a call center operator are given numerous conflict action plans. How to deal with a conflicting phone call, how to deal with that situation, different phrases even that they can say based on the situation, and they'll sit there with a book and look for the phrase that fits the situation. So it's important to have a basic plan, something that we can change, that when we're in a conflict situation, whether it's with a client or with a co-worker, then don't allow your emotions to guide your response. Ted was very bad at that. He was obviously angry, and when he went out and spoke to his co-workers, that anger overflowed and came out onto his co-workers. Don't play the blame game. It doesn't say very much about your character, and blaming somebody else who's technically on the same team as you is not helpful to anyone. And then lastly, I mentioned a little bit before, don't lie. People like to lie. It gets them out of situations. Yes, son, I tried to call you back, but your phone was off. How many of you have heard that? Happens a lot. It's not helpful. It's not helpful, and again, it doesn't say very much about your character. And then lastly, our last point, effective communication offers positive feedback. Everybody loves to feel appreciated and noticed. And the same goes for the people that we work for. Notice your co-workers. Appreciate them. If they do something well, tell them. No, it doesn't mean that you're a sucker. It just means you're saying, hey, thumbs up for doing a good job. Ted did nothing. Yes, okay, Francois maybe made mistakes that very seriously needed to be corrected. But the way he went about it could have been very different. Instead of berating Ted in front of the entire office, what he could have rather done is pulled him aside and spoken to him. Or he could have spoken to the entire accounting department and turned something that was negative into a training experience that everybody would have benefited from. So there's very different ways that we can deal or that we can employ positive reinforcement and positive feedback in the workplace. So just some quick ways that we can offer positive feedback. Do be encouraging. It's always nice to encourage the people you work with when they do something well. Do celebrate their wins. If your co-worker gets a raise and buys a new car, be happy for them. Don't begrudge them and sit there thinking, oh, I don't care. Do have a positive attitude. Somebody once said to me, if you don't know who the negative person in the workplace is, it's probably you. So you need to think about it. You don't want to be that black cloud, that person that's negative, that nobody wants to talk to. If they bump into you in the kitchen, they run in the other direction because they know that they're going to have to listen to you nagging and complaining and saying how awful their life is. It's just not fun to be around a person like that. So don't be the negative person. Don't begrudge others an opportunity. If there's something, for example, that you think is a great fit for one of your co-workers, push them to go for it. Push them to maybe take that idea to management and run with it. And lastly, don't talk about your co-workers behind their backs, especially those in management positions. Again, it doesn't say a lot about your character, and nobody is going to want to communicate with you if they know that you're the person who's going to blab what you've said to everybody else in the office. Okay, so just some practical pointers. Some of the things, there's loads more. You can Google it, there's hundreds of things on communication in the workplace. But those were some of the 5 that I felt were the most important, especially for the Mauritian workplace. So if we use those tools at our disposal, listening actively, paying attention to our body language, paying attention to the different cultures around us, handling our conflicts with diplomacy, and employing positive feedback, it will go a long way in improving the communication that we use in the workplace. And let's hope that poor Ted, the next time he's in that situation, he handles it with a lot more finesse and a lot more control. Thanks.
Whoa.